Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Genocare podcast. Today, we're going to flip things around, and Emma Snelgar, who's one of our mental health nurses at Genocare, is going to interview me about the very important topic of reproductive genetic carrier screening. This episode is really designed to be an introduction to reproductive genetic carrier screening. So some of those more experienced listeners, this might just be a bit of a refresher rather than new content. But for those who are less familiar with reproductive genetic carrier screening, hopefully it will provide a helpful overview on the topic. Over to you, Emma, and welcome.
Thank you. So to start with, can you explain to us what reproductive genetic carrier screening is and what it aims to identify?
So, reproductive genetic carrier screening is a genetic test which screens people to see if they are carriers for serious inherited genetic conditions. There are different options available, which we'll go into in responses to some of the following questions. But the purpose is really to identify people who have an increased chance for these serious inherited conditions so that they can use that information to inform planning about a future or current pregnancy.
Who should be offered reproductive genetic carrier screening?
So, current guidelines, including the Royal College of General Practitioners, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and the Human Genetics Society of Australasia, all recommend that carrier screening should be offered to anyone who's planning a pregnancy or an early pregnancy. What's really important for people to understand is the way carrier screening used to be offered is that it tended to be focused on people who had a family history of genetic conditions or were from certain genetic ancestries or ethnic backgrounds. But what we know now is that everyone has a chance of being a carrier for an inherited genetic condition. In fact, the more you screen for, the more you find out that we are actually all carriers for inherited genetic conditions. So I had genetic carrier screening and I am a carrier for a genetic condition. And it's really about whether you and your partner together are both carriers for genetic variants in the same gene that would give you an increased chance of having a child with a genetic condition, or whether a female partner is a carrier for an X-linked condition. So it's really about understanding what you're a carrier for and how that aligns with your partner's results as well. It's really important that practitioners understand that this is relevant to everybody. You do not need to have a family history in order to have children with these conditions. What we've found since we've done carrier screening much more broadly in the population is that most people who have an increased chance of having children with these conditions actually have no prior family history, or there may have been a family history, but they didn't know about it. And so that's why it's so important to offer it to everyone. There was also historically a focus on offering screening to people of certain genetic ancestries where there were certain conditions that were more common in people of those backgrounds. But because society is becoming so diverse and multicultural, it's also not appropriate just to rely on genetic ancestry or ethnicity alone in offering screening. So a universal offer really supports equity of access to that information for everyone.
That's really interesting. So what type of conditions are screened?
As I mentioned, the screening focuses on serious inherited genetic conditions. These are conditions that can have a significant impact on the health and development of a person and also have significant impacts across the family as well. These conditions are typically what we call recessive conditions. There's two types of conditions. One type is autosomal recessive conditions, and the other is X-linked conditions. Autosomal recessive conditions are conditions like cystic fibrosis and spinal muscular atrophy. With autosomal recessive conditions, both parents need to be a genetic carrier for that condition in order to have a chance of having a child with that condition. For X-linked conditions, it's only the female partner that needs to be a carrier in order to have an increased chance of having a child with that condition. Now, often when we think back to high school biology or training that we might have had in university, when we think about X-linked conditions, we often think about it affecting boys only. And that is the case for some X-linked conditions, but for other X-linked conditions, girls can be affected too. because they have the two X chromosomes instead of the one X chromosome like boys, girls can be more variable in their presentation. So I always emphasize that because for conditions like Fragile X syndrome, both males and females can be affected. So it's still useful to think about X-linked conditions primarily affecting boys, but it's really important for practitioners not to rule girls out of that situation as well. So when we're looking at what types of conditions to screen for, we're really focusing on conditions where there's really good solid evidence about what the condition, how the condition impacts a person, how common it is, and how it presents. So these conditions generally present in childhood, and they usually involve significant medical impacts. Some have reduced life expectancy, some affect particular organ systems only, some are more multi-system conditions. Many have intellectual disability associated with them, but not all of them. Some have significant and impactful treatments, but often there are very burdensome treatments if there are any treatments at all. So yeah, these conditions are generally very impactful. We tend to steer clear of, in general, reporting on conditions or screening for conditions that would have milder presentations, things that are not going to be particularly consequential in a person's life.
And I know you touched a little bit on it, but if you could just tell us when in the reproductive journey is carrier screening ideally offered?
So the best time to offer carrier screening is before pregnancy, so in the preconception stage. Really, that's just because it gives people time to contemplate what their results mean for them if they do get a result showing they have an increased chance of having children with serious genetic conditions. They also have a wider range of reproductive options available to them. You can still offer carrier screening in early pregnancy, and it should certainly be offered if people haven't had the option of considering it beforehand. But when it's offered in pregnancy, there are more limited reproductive options available to them. So what we're seeing is because carrier screening for the three most common inherited childhood onset inherited conditions, cystic fibrosis, Fragile X, and spinal muscular atrophy, is now covered under Medicare. We're seeing carrier screening increasingly making its way into general practice, antenatal care, and the fertility and IVF settings. But it's great for practitioners to be building their awareness about carrier screening and thinking about how they can offer it to people before they become pregnant.
And what carrier screening options are currently available for people in Australia?
There are two main options, or sort of two main categories. So the first is the Medicare funded screening, which I just mentioned. So that's been available since November 2023, and it was a huge leap forward to have this covered under Medicare. So for a long time, carrier screening was only available as a fee for service test. But in November 2023, it was added to the Medicare benefit schedule. And so this testing is now available to anyone across the country, generally with no out of pocket cost, which is amazing. And obviously, the focus is offering this to people planning a pregnancy or an early pregnancy. A variety of different laboratories offer this test. There are some differences between the different versions offered by the different laboratories. For practitioners out there who are starting to see more patients requesting carrier screening, it's really important to understand the differences between the different types of tests, and if you have a preferred laboratory provider, understanding the ins and outs of what their test delivers for the three different conditions. And then the other type of test is it's sometimes called expanded carrier screening, but really what it's doing is screening for a large panel of genes in a single test. So this allows hundreds or even over 1,000 different genes to be screened. It's typically offered through private laboratories, and it's usually self-funded. So the tests that are available do include the three that are covered under Medicare, but they also include a much larger number of a much wider range of conditions. And that allows people to get access to much more information about their reproductive chance for having children with these conditions.
And could you tell us a little bit about what the carrier screening process actually involves for patients and how the different screening approaches work in practice in everyday?
Yeah, so let's start with the three condition Medicare funded carrier screening. So The way that works is it follows a approach called sequential testing. And the way that works is the female partner is tested first. Now, the reason the female partner is tested first is that one of the conditions that we include in that screening is called Fragile X syndrome. And Fragile X syndrome is an X-linked condition, and so it's the female partner who has an increased chance of having children with the condition if she is a carrier. And so that's why we need to screen the female partner first. We also screen the female partner for cystic fibrosis and spinal muscular atrophy. Now, those are autosomal recessive conditions. So if the female partner is a carrier for those, then the male partner is then tested to find out whether he's also a carrier for the same condition. So that's the first approach. The second approach is simultaneous screening. Now, that's usually done for the larger screening panels. And the reason for that goes back to the comment I made earlier about the more you test for, eventually you figure out that we're all carriers for something. So before my second pregnancy, when I found out because I work in the genetic space and obviously expanded carrier screening was just coming into play then, I had expanded carrier screening. And so that's how I know that I'm a carrier for a genetic condition, because I came up as a carrier for a rarer condition that's not covered in the three gene screen that's covered under Medicare. So when you do the simultaneous screening approach, it's much more effective for expanded carrier screening because everyone's basically going to get a carrier result, and it's much more useful if you have both members of the couple's results there together, so you can look at them together rather than testing one partner, getting the carrier result, then testing the other partner, then matching it all up. From a clinical care perspective, it draws the whole process out. So it's much more effective to just screen both members of the couple at the same time and have their results together and interpret their results together. So that provides a much sort of clearer, streamlined process for both of them.
And if screening identifies that someone is a carrier for a genetic condition, what happens next?
Yeah, so there's a couple of important points to emphasize here. Being a carrier, for most conditions, being a carrier is just, there's no effect on your own health. You've got two copies of the gene, one's functioning and one's not, but the one that's functioning is making up for or is sufficient to cover the one that's not. For some of the X-linked conditions, as I mentioned, sometimes females who are carriers can have some effects. So that's one thing we always look at with X-linked conditions is, could the female partner who's the carrier be experiencing some impacts of being a carrier? If we've done the 3-condition screen and the female's a carrier for CF or SMA, then as I mentioned, we need to test the male partner. It's only if they're both together are carriers for the same condition that they have an increased chance of having children with the condition. If they've done the simultaneous screening, we've got their results together, so we don't need to test the male partner. We've already got everything together. So when we talk about people who have an increased chance of having children with a genetic condition, what we're talking about is a reproductive couple where both partners are carriers for an autosomal recessive condition, or where the female partner is a carrier for an X-linked condition. So those are referred to as increased chance couples. I want to diverge for a second and just make a quick point. Why do we use the word chance? Because often in genetics we often talk about risk, or we did in times gone by. But more recently, there's been a shift in the use of terminology to using chance because it's a more balanced and neutral term and doesn't necessarily have negative connotations about the condition. So just a little note about the word chance. So if a couple together have an increased chance of having children with these conditions, usually that increased chance is 25%. So that means for each pregnancy, they have a 25% chance of having a child with the condition and a 75% chance of having a child who's either a carrier or hasn't inherited the gene changes at all. And then if they do have an increased chance, they have a range of reproductive options available to them. So any couple who has an increased chance result should absolutely be referred for genetic counselling. It's really important that they get access to genetic counselling so they can talk through what their result means, and they can talk through what it might be like to have a child with that condition. There's a wide range of conditions that we're screening for, so it's important for people to have expert information about the particular condition. that they're carriers for. But most importantly, there'll be a substantial discussion about reproductive options, because having this information allows you to make informed reproductive choices. And so I'm preempting the next question, which is, what are those reproductive options? And so they will differ depending on the timing and the values of the person who's considering them. But if screening is available pre-conception, then one option that people can consider is IVF with pre-implantation genetic testing. And so that involves testing embryos before they're transferred and only implanting embryos that won't be affected with the condition. And we actually did a podcast episode on IVF with pre-implantation genetic testing. And so people can listen to that if they want to hear more about it. There are other options using assisted reproductive technology, like using donor sperm or donor eggs. For women who are carriers for Fragile X syndrome, sometimes they can have reduced fertility. And so sometimes they will consider using egg donors, just as an example. There are also other options like adoption or foster care, or choosing not to have children at all. The other option that's available is to conceive naturally and to consider prenatal testing. So that involves CVS or amniocentesis. And we actually did a podcast episode on those procedures as well. So again, if you want to hear more, you can listen to those. And some couples will choose to end a pregnancy if the condition is diagnosed, whereas others will use the information to plan and prepare for the birth of a child with the condition. Some people will choose not to do anything with the information. They will go ahead having their family as planned, but knowing that there is a genetic chance for the condition and knowing that they can access healthcare and support as needed. And I think what's really important to emphasize about any type of genetic testing, but particularly reproductive genetic carrier screening, is that we're really just providing information and options. So we're not offering it to direct people's choices in any particular way. It's about enabling people to be informed and empowered in their reproductive planning. And the reason we offer this is really because we've done decades of research in this area, which shows that people support the idea of carrier screening, provided it's offered in an optional way, and that they value the opportunity to have access to information that can inform their reproductive planning.
And lastly, was there anything else that you would like people to understand about the role of reproductive genetic carrier screening in reproductive?
Yeah, so I think, like, I've done so many educational presentations on this topic over the years. I think those who are listening who know me know that reproductive carrier screening has been my wheelhouse for quite a long time. And I think one thing that comes up quite a lot when I'm giving education presentations to healthcare professionals is there'll usually be a medical practitioner sitting up the back who puts their hand up and says, "Aren't we just worrying everybody too much? Isn't this just causing all this concern?" Some people might say, "I didn't have this when I had my children and everything was fine." And I think it's a really interesting one, because when you talk to parents of children who have had children with these conditions, they often say, "I wish I had access to this information before I started my family." And again, it's not about directing people in any particular direction, but people want the information. They want to be empowered. They want to be able to make informed choices. And I think sometimes also as society, and Emma, I'm interested in what you think about this, is there's often a fear of emotional impacts and responses. There's nothing really wrong with a little bit of anxiety if it's giving people really helpful, empowering information. If it puts people through a particular period of time that is stressful, but you can do it in a way that they're supported, what our research tells us that is that people would value that far more than avoiding a bit of anxiety in being offered and accessing testing. So I often try and challenge that perspective and say, it's not about worrying people. It's about giving them really important information and empowering them and supporting them so that we can allow them to navigate this and manage whatever worry, concern, anxiety, or psychosocial impact exists. I don't know. I'm interested. What are your thoughts on that? That view that, oh, are we just worrying people too much? Or are we worried about worry?
As you were talking, gave me the picture of, say, for example, you go to your junk cupboard and you look at it and go, oh my gosh, I don't even know what's in here, and it's messy, and that's going to be really hard to go through and sort and organize, and not looking at it in itself can create anxiety. And so you open the door, you take everything out. It can be a really painful process. It can be a process of having to go through everything and look what's there. And it's not a fun process, but when it's done and you know what's there and everything's organized 9 times out of 10, or most of the time, it's all fine. You shut it and then you feel a lot of relief and go, oh my gosh, thank goodness that's done. And then every now and again you find something that you go, oh, I really have to deal with that. Oh, I forgot that was there, or oh, I have been putting that off. And then you have to go and deal with it. But for most of the time, I know what's there now, and it's organized and it's done, and I feel better. So it's a painful process to go through. But on the other side, there's that relief and reassurance, or that you just feel better about it. So it's a little bit like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. And it matches what the research that we've done shows us as well. People go, yeah, okay, yeah, there's a little bit here and it's raising a few questions for me. But ultimately, I'm glad that I went through the process, and I'm glad that I have the information. And even people who do get increased chance results, our literature does show that it is a stressful experience to get those increased chance results, and it does have a psychosocial impact, which can be mitigated through good supports. And that's partly why I was motivated to create Genocare, for that exact reason, so that we could wrap some more psychosocial support around people when they're getting this information. But ultimately, there's very little regret about having the information. People are generally grateful to have had the opportunity to access the information. So I think it's really important that there's not this sort of consideration about anyone being a gatekeeper to someone's access to that information, and let people have the opportunity to choose. I was also just thinking, another common concern I hear from health professionals is, gosh, this just seems like such a big topic, and I've got such limited time with my patients, and I just don't really know how to tackle raising this. And so we've done a lot of work with healthcare practitioners around the barriers and enablers around offering carrier screening. And I think it's really important for practitioners to not feel like there's a huge burden in having to explain in great detail the ins and outs of carrier screening, because there's lots of good resources that now exist about carrier screening. And so people can be referred to those resources to read more. But a practitioner's real role is actually just to offer the test and introduce the concept. So often I try and reassure practitioners that it's really important to offer the screening, and it's so important that we have equity of access to screening, because at the moment what the Medicare data shows is that there's about 120,000 people every year having carrier screening, which is amazing, and it's about a 6-fold increase from what we had before the Medicare item number came in. But in comparison, there are about 300,000 pregnancies each year. And I know we're not comparing those, for those sort of data nerds, those numbers, we're not really comparing apples with apples. But what it suggests is that not everyone who could access carrier screening is having it. And so practitioners play a really important role in making people aware about it. And I think some practitioners are nervous about offering it because they don't feel confident enough to do it. And so I would really encourage those who are feeling like that to not feel like they have to go into a huge amount of detail, but that they can refer people to good quality information sources. And we can pop some of those in the show notes so that people can have a look at those as well.
That's a really important point. Hey, was there anything else that you wanted to add at the end of this conversation?
I can't think of anything. Can you think of anything off the top of your head, Emma? Because I guess you've come into this is a newer piece to the journey. And yeah, is there anything that you're interested to know about carrier screening?
I think you've covered all of the bases. It's just, how does carrier screening differ to other types of screening? You've potentially covered that in other podcasts you could refer people to.
That is actually a super good question. And I should have thought of that because it's another common misconception about carrier screening. So, those who are less familiar about carrier screening sometimes get it confused with non invasive prenatal testing. So, non invasive prenatal testing is looking at screening for chromosome conditions, whereas genetic carrier screening is screening for changes in particular genes. And so they're two totally different tests. And so sometimes practitioners will say to me, oh, but I'm offering my patients NIPT. So I think that's covered, right? So they're not, they're totally different tests. And so patients should actually be offered screening for chromosome conditions, which includes NIPT, and you could also some patients might consider combined first trimester screening, and then they should also be offered carrier screening. And then in early pregnancy, the third thing that they should be offered is also a first trimester ultrasound. So it's important for practitioners to understand carrier screening is different to NIPT. And we will do an episode on NIPT coming up so that people know all about that. But there's generally more awareness about NIPT than there is about carrier screening. Yet, really important for people to know that they're two different tests.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
You are so welcome.